Hey guys, in this video, I want to explain the difference between cacao and cocoa. At first glance, you might think that cacao and cocoa are the same thing. Let's say you're buying a chocolate bar and you turn it over to read the ingredients. You might not even recognize the difference between cacao or cocoa, unless of course you've learned previously that there are differences. Now with that being said, there are important similarities to understand between cacao and cocoa. And perhaps the most important or fundamental similarity is that they are generally both referring to the same raw material. So both cacao and cocoa come from the bean or the seed of the cacao pod that comes from the Theobroma cacao tree. So they're originally from the same species of tree, and although those trees might be grown differently and grown in different regions, there might be a certain quality to that plant, as with any other plant, that we'll get into in a moment. Generally speaking, that species of tree produces a pod or a fruit, and within that pod, there are seeds that are edible. And those seeds are then processed in different ways to produce either cacao or cocoa. So that's perhaps the major similarity, is that they're coming from the same species of tree and ultimately having a very similar raw material or raw starting point. However, there are some differences, some major differences that can occur beyond that point. And that's what I want to explain in the bulk of this video, is the differences that set apart the cacao versus the cocoa product when you see it in a store or if you're buying it online. Now, from the initial harvest of the cacao pod from the cacao tree, whether it's going to be cacao or cocoa, that bean is still more or less very much the same in either one of these products. Because the first step to making either a cacao or cocoa product is fermenting that seed. So typically what is done is the cacao pod or fruit is harvested, and that fruit or pulp is extracted from the cacao pod. So it's generally split open, and inside you're going to see something that looks like this, and the beans are within that white sort of lemony sweet or sour fruit. And that stuff is taken out and then placed into some sort of container where it is then fermented. So at this point, cacao and cocoa are going through the same process of fermentation. That's the initial stages that both products go through. And the importance here is to first and foremost make that bean or seed more edible. And the second thing is going to be to cultivate the right color. So originally the beans or seeds are more of a white, fleshy color, and through the fermentation process they become more purple and ultimately brown or that chocolate color. The last thing that's important about the fermentation process is getting that chocolate flavor. If you ever eat a cacao bean or seed right out of the pod, it doesn't taste very much like chocolate. It's the fermentation process that gives cacao or cocoa or chocolate the chocolatey taste. And it's from this point, after the fermentation process, that cacao and cocoa are separated as two different things. Because the general difference between cacao and cocoa is the processing beyond the fermentation. In the most basic sense, cacao refers to the most minimally processed, purest form of chocolate that you can get. It is generally only fermented and then left to sun dry, and from that point it's either left in the whole bean, it's chopped up into cacao nibs like this, or it's ultimately ground up into cacao powder like this. And because of the fact that cacao is very minimally processed, it tends to have a higher concentration of antioxidants, B vitamins, vitamin C, and other heat-sensitive nutrients that can be destroyed through the heat process. Which brings us to cocoa. The major difference between cacao and cocoa is that cocoa is intensely heated. And the reason that it's usually heated is for flavor profile purposes. So different types of temperatures, different heating processes, for example, a Dutch processed cacao uses not only high heat temperatures, but also an alkalizer to remove some of the acidity and to give it a certain chocolatey flavor that chocolate confectioners and people who make chocolate tend to like or prefer over raw chocolate. again in terms of taste and flavor, and sometimes even color. However, through the processing and the intense use of heat and the alkalization processes, sometimes this can destroy a lot of the various nutrients that you would find in raw cacao. Now, cocoa does contain still a high amount of antioxidants, and there are still beneficial components to it. It does still contain some of the fibers and the proteins, and again, those antioxidants. But generally speaking, raw cacao is going to have a greater number of those antioxidants, and it also has things like vitamin C and other B vitamins, which might be destroyed through the processing, especially through the alkalization or the Dutch processing in really extreme high temperatures. So those are perhaps the major similarities and differences, but something that I've tend to observe at least is that products made from raw, unprocessed cacao tend to be usually organic, and if not organic, they at least seem to come from small batch farms where there's a greater level of quality control, and also the soil that those trees are grown in tend to be of higher quality as well, because one thing that can happen in a negative way when you get into these massive monocultures and you're growing tons and tons of product is that with the gain of massive product development or production, you tend to lose quality, and particularly the quality of the soil can become depleted, and that can negatively affect the nutritional quality of that cacao product, or in this case, the cocoa product. So it seems more often than not that cocoa products come from these large-scale industrial cocoa farms where the quality of the soil is likely subpar to that of small batch heirloom cacao products. And also there tends to be a greater use of herbicides and pesticides. So it's less common that you find an organic cocoa powder, whereas organic cacao products tend to be more commonly found. Now, this might not be 100% of the time or completely matter of fact. I'm sure there are good, high quality organic cocoa products out there. It's just, again, a personal observation, something I tend to see in my research and looking for high quality cacao products. So if you are, let's say, leaning towards a cocoa product in terms of taste for whatever reason, a couple of things just to look out for is if you can get an organic cocoa product, do it. Something that comes from a smaller batch farm, if you can find that. And in general, if you're buying a product that is comprised or made mostly of cocoa, let's say a chocolate mix or a chocolate bar, just make sure that it has no other added fillers, synthetic chemicals, dyes, etc. So those are a couple of tips if you're leaning down the cocoa end of things. However, my personal recommendation would be to stick with quality, raw, organic cacao powder, something like this, where you can just make your own chocolate products. It's actually very simple to make chocolate bars at home with minimal ingredients, and it doesn't take much time at all, actually. So if you're interested in making your own chocolate, you can reference this video to learn how to make a simple DIY chocolate bar using, again, minimal ingredients, ensuring the highest quality chocolate bar. And of course, you can always just add the raw cacao powder to smoothies and nut milks or various milks to make your own hot chocolates, and you can add it to baked goods. Sky's the limit to get that chocolate fix, but without getting any of the added unnecessary chemicals, pesticides, but also getting a high amount of the medicinal constituents that you find in chocolate that we talk about here on the channel. However, that does bring this video to a close. I figured I would just make this video since we've been getting questions about our cacao powder and what makes it different from others ever since we've released our VitaJing cacao powder. If you've enjoyed this video and found it helpful, be sure to give it a thumbs up. Share it with anybody that might find it helpful or useful. Also, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel if you haven't yet already. And of course, if you're interested in learning more or purchasing a high quality organic raw cacao powder that has been minimally processed in the purest form, definitely check out our online tonic herb shop in the description box below.